All right, hello there, and here's the lecture that goes with chapter 3. The chapter is all about listening, and of course, I've asked you to watch my introductory video. It's like a few, 12, 13 minutes long, and also to watch that video by Julian Fellows on YouTube. The link is right there in the email that I sent out the announcement. So that you can go and have a look at that, because I'm going to talk about Julian Fellows' presentation here in a few minutes, and so it's important that you watch it first. You can always pause this and then go back and watch the video and then come back to my PowerPoint. So anyway, so how to get the most out of what you hear. Sorry, are you listening? Okay. Well, anyway, some of what I've already talked about in my little introduction, I'll repeat here, but that's fine. We'll go over this together, well, more or less together. Okay, so the big difference, understanding the difference between hearing and listening, and there is, as I've mentioned in the intro, quite a difference between those two activities. So we've got a couple of kids here playing telephone with cans and a string. It does work. Remember in my intro I talked about sound waves and vibrations. That's exactly what makes that work. All right, so if you've ever been to a party, and I haven't been to one in a long time, but if you've ever been to a party, one of the games you might have played, especially as a kid, like at a birthday party or something, is where everyone's sitting around the room and one person is given a little piece of paper with a sentence or two on it, and they whisper that exactly what's on that paper into the ear of the person sitting next to them. And then that person whispers what they heard into the next person's ear, so on down the line. And the last person has to repeat what they heard. And usually it's a long way from what was originally written on that paper. Hearing and listening. Okay, there is a big difference. So, as I said before, and I'm hearing a clock in the background, hearing is not the same as listening. Hearing is a passive experience. And once again, I talked about this in my introductory video, but to reinforce it, we are constantly being bombarded by auditory sensations. And if you have good working ears, and I realize people will have hearing impairments, deafness, and so on, but assuming we're talking about normal ability to hear, you're constantly receiving the sound wave inputs. It's always there. We may or may not pay attention to it. It's just passive. And active is exactly that. That's when we go from just hearing sounds to trying to figure out what we're actually listening to, paying attention, and understanding what those sounds may mean. All right. So, as I said, we hear 100% of the time. We're always hearing some kind of auditory sensation. But listening, and that's passive, that 100% of the time. But listening is active. Now you might say, well, Ray, you mentioned that in the intro, but even when you're sleeping, remember, I'm a light sleeper. And so I tend to hear sounds very easily. They wake me up. Oh, I hate alarm clocks, don't you? But typically, while I'm resting or even when I'm working, there's all kinds of sounds going on around me right now that I'm just simply not paying attention to. It's passive. But the listening part of it, well, here's the kicker. When we actually try to listen, active listening, we do this about 60% of the time that we're awake, not 60% of the 24-hour day. While we're awake, we actively listen approximately 60% of the time. Maybe that's an estimate. And then another estimate is that we only retain about 25% of what we've been listening to. I don't know if that's depressing or not, but there's a reason for that. And I talked about attention span. Part of it is just our ability to pay attention for any given length of time. 8 seconds, I talked about that. Microsoft, I don't know where they got that number, but anyway, 8 seconds. But every 8 seconds or so, we unconsciously are refocusing our attention. And it may be a slight distraction. We may not even realize we're doing it, but we're doing it. But again, the average adult attention span is about 20 minutes. So yeah, we've got the 60% of the time that we're really trying to actively listen. But because of all these outside factors, the average attention span of 20 minutes or so, it makes it difficult to completely absorb, even while we're active listening, all the time. So yeah, you can remember those numbers. 100% of passive time is passive hearing. Make sure I get it right. Passive hearing. 60% of the time that we're awake, we're actively listening, and only about 25% of that do we retain. All right. Now, the book tells us that there's 3 different kinds of listening. There's appreciative listening, empathetic listening, and comprehensive listening. Appreciative listening. Now, when you read the chapter about adapting to audiences, there's audiences that come to hear something because they want to be there. They're voluntary listeners. That's something we do all the time. We listen to things because we want to, especially music. I think that's a really good example. We listen to music because we want to. Now, I know and maybe it's just because of dealing with communications for so many years, I can walk through a grocery store and tell you what music they were playing when I walk out. I try to tune it out, make it passive. It's hard for me to do that. But generally speaking, when I pick a piece of music, I want to actively listen to it. How many of you study with music in the background? There's been some research that suggests that's not actually a good idea. I don't know. I love classical music. I specifically love music from the Baroque era. And so when I'm working quietly in my office, I quite often have that going in the background. And even though it's appreciative listening, it's kind of on a passive scale, isn't it? I'm not paying specific attention to it. But sometimes there's those pieces of music that I want to listen to. Okay, so appreciative listening, that's pretty obvious. Empathetic listening. Empathetic listening. Empathetic listening is, we've all had this experience where a friend, they come and they put their head on the shoulder. And they say, oh, that guy's a jerk. I've got to get rid of him, blah, blah, blah. And your reaction is, yeah, I know. I understand. I get it. Okay, empathetic listening. You're genuinely trying to connect with the person that's talking to you in this particular case. Do we do empathetic listening during a speech? Well, if the speaker's good and is trying to connect with the audience through storytelling and pathos, emotional content, yes, then we become empathetic listeners even in a speech. Oh, by the way, you can also make money as an empathetic listener. Can you think of any jobs that require empathetic listening? Yeah, well, sure. Psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, people in the medical field, they not only want to just hear what you're saying, but they want to empathize with you. And I had to put the character from those movies. Oh, wait a minute. What are security guys at a Samsung phone store called? Guardians of the Galaxy. Oh, Ray, stop. Wait, well, anyway, if you watch those movies, one of the characters in the movies was this creature. She was an empath. And you can tell that because I guess empaths have little antenna growing out of their head. But she was so in tune with empathetic listening, if you want, that she could almost suck it out of a person's brain. She even did that to Thanos in one of the other movies. I can't even keep all my movies straight. So anyway, empathetic listening. Now, comprehensive listening, again, this is obvious. You're listening because you're trying to really understand what the speaker is saying. As students, you do this all the time. You're constantly doing you're constantly trying to do comprehensive listening. Once again, it's tough to stay focused. I know when the college asks me occasionally to do a once a week 3-hour class, it's all I can do to say yes, because I really hate it. Not because I dislike the class, it's just that it's really tough for the students and me as a presenter to be on focus, on task for that length of time. Those are tough classes, and if you've taken one, you understand that. So comprehensive listening, where you're really trying to, as I say here, get the message. Now, critical listening, evaluation, what's the purpose of whatever it is that you're listening to. Let me talk about just the idea of critical listening. This is where, as a comprehensive listener, you're not just simply taking notes and trying to keep up with what's being said, but you're truly evaluating what's being said. Do I believe this speaker? Do I really understand what they're trying to say? That's critical listening. And I'll say more about that in the future as well. So you need to be an active listener. You need to try to stay focused. Okay, resist the dark side. Oh, excuse me, again, the wrong movie here. Resist distractions. Yeah, put your phone away. I've been teaching for 30 some years. I'm not even sure. It's well over 30 years at this point. And when I taught my first communication class, way back when, I was in Memphis, Tennessee, of all places, at the University of Memphis, there were no cell phones. Oh my God, there was no internet. Oh, can you imagine a world without cell phones and internet? Somehow we survived. And so I felt that I wasn't constantly trying to help my students refocus. Now, I see people sitting in class with their cell phones down where, they think they're hidden. I know they're looking at the cell phone, playing Candy Crush. Does anybody play Candy Crush anymore? The point is, you've got to try to get rid of the distractions. It's really tough. Put the phone away. Try to focus on what's being said. One of the things that drives me bonkers is when I'm in a situation, maybe at home or someone else's house, where I'm trying to listen comprehensively or empathetically, whatever it might be, to someone who's talking to me and that television's running in the background. Turn it off. Just turn it off. Whatever you can do to get rid of distractions will make you a better comprehensive listener, empathetic, or even appreciative listener. So get rid of those distractions. All right, now in the book, chapter 3, it talks about the HURIER model of listening. And there's 6 steps. This is a 6-step situation. And if you're aware of these steps, it can help you become a better listener. And oh my gosh, is that me? No, not well anyway. Maybe not. All right, so the 6 steps are hearing, understanding, remembering, interpreting, evaluating, and responding. We unconsciously go through this process every time we become comprehensive listeners. So the important thing, well, there's a number of important things here, but one of the major aspects is that hearing, I've already talked about this over and over again, hearing is passive. We do it all the time. But in this model, we want to move from hearing to understanding. In other words, we're moving from a passive situation to an active situation. Okay, so now we've become active listeners, remembering what's the importance of what we're listening to, interpreting, evaluating, and then having some kind of actual response to all of this. Well, here, the authors of the book provided this fun little diagram and of the Hurrier model of effective listening. So I'm going to look at, I have a bigger screen over here. I'm going to look over here for just a moment. Excuse my profile. So here's the model in practice. Okay, so hearing. Okay, we've got a dog situation going on here. Now this is Otis. Otis is a smart little dog, and look at the size of his ears. Man, he's hearing all the time. But like any other creature, he does a lot of passive hearing, but now he's moving into active listening because the lady, his owner, says, Otis, do you want a cookie? So Otis perks up and he goes from passive into active listening and understanding. He recognizes the word cookie. All right. So the lady has his attention. Okay, he's actively listening now. But he hears the word cookie and he immediately remembers, I've had these things before. I remember that word. Cookie means something good to eat. Okay, so then he's got to interpret what's going on. He's thinking, well, she sounds happy. She's not, Otis, you bad dog. No, this is the lady saying, Otis, you want a cookie? Oh, and I can tell by the tone of voice, she's asking me a question. Okay, so now Otis has to figure out what he needs to do. Well, she wants me to let her know that, yeah, you bet I'd like that cookie. So what do I need to do? I need to respond, woof, you bet, I'll take the cookie. All right, so there's the Hurrier model of listening in action. So, well, we've gone from passive hearing to active listening and understanding, remembering what it is that we're hearing, interpreting it, evaluating it, and responding. Let me give one more example here. You're out in the country. You're in Nebraska for some reason. All right, and you come to a railroad crossing, and it's just the railroad crossing, with the sign, railroad crossing. But you're a cautious driver, so you stop, and you go into your active listening mode, you're hearing, and off in the distance, I'm getting ahead of myself, off in the distance you hear, woo, woo. Okay, so you're hearing a sound. That's when you go into the understanding. You're listening actively now. And you think, I remember that sound. Okay, remembering. That's the sound of a train whistle. I wonder if the train is nearby. So you begin interpreting and you think, trains are big and heavy. And if they hit my car, it could be really bad. And you remember pictures of cars that have been hit by trains. So you have to evaluate. That train whistle sounds pretty close. So what am I going to do? What's my response? I'm going to sit there and let the train go by. So we do this all the time. This Hurrier model may seem a little silly, but in fact, this is exactly how we do comprehensive listening. All right, now, in life, never assume anything is actually my rule number one. But for the moment, I'll bend or even break that rule and assume that you have watched Julian Treasure's 7-minute video. If you haven't, go ahead and pause my PowerPoint and go comprehensively listen to his presentation, watch the video on YouTube. The link is right there in the announcement that I set out. Now I'm going to, again, assume that I can move on and talk about what Mr. Treasure discussed in his presentation. All right, one of the first things Treasure mentioned and I love his name, don't you? But anyway, one of the first things that he talked about was listening filters, and he listed a bunch of stuff here: culture, language, values, beliefs, attitudes, expectations, intentions. Okay, I intend to go to class and be a good listener. Okay, there's an old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Yeah, okay, sometimes it's hard to actually follow through with the intentions. Treasure gives the example of promising his wife that every day his intention was to listen to her as carefully as the first day that they met. Yeah, it's hard to follow through, obviously. But let's go back to the top of the list for a moment. Culture. Culture is a good example. The culture we grow up in provides, oh, well, I have to jump down here a little bit, different values, different beliefs, and different attitudes, doesn't it? Depending on where we grow up. I know that in my classes here at CSN and at other universities, I have a lot of international students. And so I have to be aware that what they hear me say may not be what I intend all the time. I need to be careful to explain myself. A good example, some years ago, I had a chance to do one of those exchange teacher things, and I spent some time teaching in northern Italy, in the city of Brescia, Italy, right in the foothills of the Italian Alps. Beautiful place. And uh, I was talking about an old Native American story about how Coyote steals a bag full of stars. And I called it a bag. And I did this for several classes. And finally, one of the students came up to me and said, you know, if you use the word sack instead of bag, everyone would get it better. Okay, it was a cultural thing. In Italy, France, Spain, I'm assuming, uh, it's much more common to call what we would just simply say bag a sac, le sac. Okay, so there was an example of me not, as a speaker, being in tune with the cultural aspects of uh, what I was dealing with, but also the understanding of this, in this case, the vocabulary. So culture, it works both ways, as the speaker and as the listener. We filter what we hear based on the culture that we grow up in. And of course, language. I know many of you, English is a second language, and that's why even with my jokes, what you hear may not be funny at all. Maybe the joke I told about the cowboy and brown paper bag Pete rustling. All right, you know, if you're not familiar with the language, you may have in trouble interpreting what you're hearing. Again, beliefs, attitudes, what you expect to get out of it. All of these are areas that can cause us issues in being effective listeners. And I'll flip that and say also effective speakers. All right. Now, he talked about some other cool things that I like what he's talking about, because I think just the act of listening can be such a wonderful experience. Treasure suggested that you try to spend about 3 minutes a day in silence. Yeah, who can do that anymore? It's tough. We always have something going on. But he did mention, even if you can just spend 3 minutes of quiet time, that it really helps improve your listening skills. And you know, you might think about the forest primeval kind of thing, you know, the sounds of nature. Now, down here in the lower corner of my slide, and my image is kind of impinging on it a bit, is something known as an anechoic chamber. NASA uses chambers like this to test satellites, and I've had a chance to work in some of those, and it's the most bizarre experience, because when you go into an anechoic chamber, it's designed to deaden all sound. It's bizarre. It's sensory deprivation. You go in there and you stand in the center of that room, and it's complete silence. It's really rather creepy. It's kind of like the only thing you hear is your own heartbeat. Uh, we as humans aren't used to that kind of total silence. There's always something going on. And he, uh, Treasure mentions the mixer where there's all kinds of sounds going on at once. He used examples of, like, you're at Starbucks and there's a lot of people talking. The sound of that barista making the latte. You pick these sounds out, and then savoring and the hidden choir. I'll just give a few examples. I really like what he talks about with savoring sounds. It's something we don't do much, is it? This is an actual photograph of a spot less than a mile from the house I grew up in southwestern Michigan, little town called St. Joseph, Michigan. And yeah, this place is still there, right on Lake Michigan. And the old, I'm pointing, well, anyway, the bigger building there of the lighthouse, there used to be the old, it was called a diaphragmatic foghorn. And it sounded something like, boo. What a sound. And when I was a kid on foggy nights, I'd sleep with my window open so that I could hear that. I could savor the sound of that foghorn. Just loved it. Years ago, they took the old diaphragmatic foghorn out and they replaced it with a much higher pitched sound that probably can be heard better out on the lake. Boo! Now, who wants to listen to that in the dead of night? Anyway, so they changed it. Fellows also mentioned the sound of his dryer. He called it the tumble dryer, the dryer machine. My little office here at home is right next to our little bitty laundry room. And personally, I can't stand the sound of the dryer as everything's clunking around in there. So, we savor different sounds. Again, here in my house, oops, you can't see it very well. There's my grandfather clock. Uh, Sometimes, we all have those nights where we just can't get to sleep. Sometimes I'll go out and stretch out on the couch in the living room, and I savor the sound of that big ticking clock. So, sure, we can do active listening to sounds that normally would just be regarded as passive background noise. So, the hidden choir. So being a better listener, listening positions, and what Fellows means by this, and excuse me, what Treasure, the different speaker, what Treasure means by this in his little presentation, he talks about active and passive, just as I have, reductive, narrowing in, focusing on what you're hearing, expansive, taking in a larger soundscape if you want. And then I've talked about critical and empathetic listening. These are all listening techniques that really provides us with a larger, better experience within our lives. It really, truly does. And then he finally talks about this rasa, and he says it's from the Sanskrit for juice. And I don't see my point. Oh, there's my pointer. You can see here, this is an example of Indian Sanskrit. And just so you know, because you can't see this, if I can even get it in the camera, I have this tattooed to my wrist. Anyway, it's the Om, the sound of creation. Om. All right. And rasa is Sanskrit for juice or essence. And he's saying, yes, we need to receive. We need to be active listeners. We need to appreciate what we're hearing. We need to understand, to summarize that. And if you're in a one-on-one conversation, or even as a member of an audience, ask can mean basically responding to what we're hearing. So rasa. I like that. Perceive, appreciate, summarize. And he says ask because he wanted to stick with the acronym here, but responding in some way. So did you hear? Did you catch all this? All right, so I hope so. And then finally, I need to end with one of my favorite characters, good old Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory. No, I'm listening. It just takes me a minute to process so much stupid all at once. All right. Well, good listening. You're welcome to watch this anytime you like. And remember, I do download the PowerPoint itself into the file so you can go back and just review the PowerPoint without having to watch the video. Thanks a lot. Here we go.